Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a soul like me. You know, in the mid 90s, we switched in our gray hymnal to add an asterisk after the word wretch, giving people the option to use the word soul. And it was for all those people who really loved the hymn, but whose theology stumbled every time they had to refer to themselves as wretched. I was one of those people. John Newton, when he wrote the hymn, was referring to his transformation from being the captain of a slave ship to becoming the pastor of a church in a New England town. He was speaking of an inward awakening, a newfound humility. But when I sang it, I veered well beyond his intent toward humility into the realm of unworthy and unacceptable, even unlovable. For me, the word wretch, when I sang it, triggered a sense of deep shame, a struggle that so feared feeling bad that I spent inordinate amounts of time trying to be perfect. The sermon this morning is about love, our need for it, our search for it, and our struggle for it, and our deep struggle to show up for the love that we need, even when we don't feel like we deserve it. Raise your hand if you have ever been one of those people. I fear a great many of us have settled for living what I sometimes tend to call prophylactic lives, where we cover ourselves up, where we try and protect ourselves, where we wear a more perfect image over our real selves that we think will protect us from painful judgment or the criticism that we fear. And we think that this will be an antidote to worries of not being smart enough or pretty enough or funny enough or nice enough. This morning, I want to talk about that drilled in feeling of not enough. Author and social researcher Brené Brown points out that the majority of people living in today's world go to bed almost every night feeling like they didn't get enough done. And they wake up every morning feeling like they didn't get enough sleep. And in between waking and sleeping, we worry about not feeling safe enough or rich enough or thin enough or good enough. It's all a scarcity mentality. But do you know the number one casualty of living in a scarcity mentality? Vulnerability. Well, of course, you might think, why would anyone who already feels not enough want to advertise it? We want to cover it up. Sometimes we cover up our insecurity, though, with anger or drama, because those emotions are easier than insecurity. Or often we just try to pretend that nothing's wrong. We impose a veneer of indifference, sometimes prompting us to not even show up for things that we thought might be important. Which is fine for a while, until we encounter those moments where we have to show up. Like the time very early in my career where I was candidating at a new church, and for the final sermon, the sermon where they would vote on whether or not to call me, I went in to preach that morning with a zit roughly the size of Rhode Island right on the tip of my nose. And I had to talk to people as if nothing was wrong. This morning is a sermon about imperfect people trying to be perfect. Trying to be perfect is the number one response to feeling vulnerable. We think that being perfect, or at least appearing perfect, will make everything easier. But the thing that I learned after so many years of trying was that being perfect is painful too, perhaps even more painful than being a wretch. Being perfect means always trying harder. It means always doing more. It means always having to be right. Being perfect is lonely. It means never being able to admit that you need help, or that you don't know, or that you can't make it on your own. Writer Albert Camus named our struggle when he said, "Most people never realize how much effort it takes others merely to be normal. Imagine the effort it takes to be perfect." Does any of this sound familiar? Maybe you had older brothers and sisters who got more of your parents' attention or approval than you. Have you ever gotten a B and then been told you should have gotten an A? Ever compare your hair or skin or physique with movie stars or models in magazines? Didn't measure up on someone's good parenting scale? Scored low on the latest self-evaluation quiz on Facebook? Saying yes to any of these does not mean that you have a problem with perfectionism, but perfectionism becomes a problem when we notice all the voices that judged or criticized us when we were young, like parents or teachers or siblings or bosses. All those voices are still in our heads years later. And what's more, they've organized. They started a union and they rent out space in our brain and they built up a business of telling us to be a little faster, a little cleaner, a little more conscientious, or show more patience. I grew up with a chorus line of those voices in my head. And Brene Brown points out that these voices really just comprise our ego, what she calls the hustle committee. The hustle committee is always shouting more, faster, harder. And in the beginning, we're led to believe that these voices are actually on our side, that they're just trying to help us be noticed or popular or important. But after a while, it begins to seem that all they do is find different ways to tell us we're not enough, to call us a wretch. And if you're like me, after a while, you can begin to really hate the committee. The Reverend Barbara Merritt described the propaganda sheet that's often handed out or promoted by the committee in her head. Her list went something like this: perfect children are always popular and friendly. They're always neat and clean and polite. They're always cheerful, never angry. Perfect professionals are always calm and know what to do. They never ask for help. They're always prompt and careful and competent. They're at work early and they stay late. They finish their work every day. They never procrastinate. The perfect artist always sells their work. The perfect manager always gets promoted. The perfect teacher always has bright, eager kids who score high. Perfect ministers love everyone, all the time, no exceptions. And they write perfect sermons every week. That's the propaganda published in my head. And the most hurtful thing that my committee got me to believe was perfect people are perfectly lovable. Sound familiar? Years ago, I had a friend, Susan, who told me a story that was part of her not enough narrative. As a little girl, she got $1 a week allowance, but instead of spending it on herself, she saved all of her pennies, wrapped them in tissue paper and tied them at the top with Scotch tape, and then put a tag on them that said, "To God." And then, climbing the ladder to the attic where God obviously lived, she deposited her bundle of pennies. So certain was she that she didn't measure up, that she even had to bribe God. Each week she left the new bundle where the last one had been taken. And it wasn't till years later that she discovered that it was not God, but actually her big sister who was accepting her contrition. The problem with perfection is that it makes us feel like we have to bribe people with time or compliments or money in order to deserve love? What of yourself have you given away trying to be perfect? Problems with perfection can also be seen when we deny our imperfections. When I turned 12, I moved to a new neighborhood where I attended a new school and had two paralyzing fears. First, that I would have no friends, and second, that it was the first time in my life where we would be dressing out for PE. On the first day of school, I met Spence, and we helped each other through those first awkward moments. But the following Monday was our first day of PE, and Spence came to me in the morning and said that he felt unsure, a little intimidated about showering with the bigger boys. When he asked if I was scared, I didn't want to appear wimpy, even though I was terrified. So I said, no, why should I be? Denying my imperfections ended up costing me Spence's friendship. He didn't trust me to understand his fears or to be honest with my own. It's tempting to try and hide behind veils of perfection, disguising our flaws, covering up our insecurities. But it becomes a problem when we actually give up who we are to try to be something we're not. And when we can't even tell the difference between the voices of the committee and our own voice. When we spend all of our energy trying to be perfect and it's still not satisfying. It's not satisfying because we begin to confuse self-acceptance with self-absorption, which can all be summed up in the adage, well, I may not be much, but I'm all I think about. Forrest Church, former minister of All Souls in New York City, comments that just as self-righteousness is the opposite of righteousness, self-consciousness is the opposite of consciousness. When we spend so much energy and attention on ourselves trying to be perfect, we don't have enough energy left to show up for the people who really want to get to know us. The problem with trying to be perfect is that we end up becoming perfect strangers. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. After a lot of work, I came to a place where I could translate wretch as simply meaning imperfect. And I began to realize that at least theoretically, I didn't need to be perfect, but I was still deeply resistant to being vulnerable. The trouble is, we can't avoid vulnerability, warns Brene Brown, because vulnerability is the most accurate measure of courage. It is the birthplace of everything we are hungry for, like joy and creativity and innovation and love and faith. And the big one, connection. It's a lousy trade, perfection for connection, and it's a choice we have to think about carefully because it's really hard to love something that's perfect. It's easy, on the other hand, I found it so, to fall in love with this congregation. Here we are, 100 members, and to my count so far, roughly 4,000 opinions about where to go and what we need to do and how it is that we're going to get there. And like so many other communities, we could probably count more failed attempts at enlightenment than we have at solving the world's problems. But there is one thing that I am very sure of, and that is that when we as a community begin to see beyond our imperfection, beyond others' imperfection, when we see how to love beyond limits, nothing will be impossible for us. There's a place beyond focusing on and pointing out other people's faults and beyond even focusing on our own, and that place is being willing to intentionally and bravely risk letting people witness our becoming. When I was an intern in Toronto, my intern committee at my midterm evaluation said that they really liked me and they wanted to get to know me, but they worried that I was trying too hard to be perfect. They said it felt like there was always a veneer that they had to look through in order to get close to me. My intern committee had to get to know me. It's their job. What happens when we hold up all of this perfection and people don't have to get to know us? Sharing our less than perfect sides is hard and risky. It goes against everything the committee in our head is telling us, but is often the most important thing that people look for when they are trying to connect. It is our humanness, not our godliness, that is most lovable about us. That is what Spence was looking for. That was what my intern committee was looking for. And that's what we all look for when we want love. Approval is nice, but connection goes deeper. Approval is for what we show. Connection is for who we are. Approval validates our image. Connection comforts our soul. We are not perfect, but that's because we are not done yet. We are still immersed in our becoming, and it is our undoneness, our frayed edges, our tatteredness and tenderness that attracts compassion and understanding and the love that we want. So in a sense, it is our wretchedness that works for us, not against us, if we let it show. That is grace. Love which we don't have to earn, don't have to lie for, or get through bribes. Love that comes without standards or justification, but simply because we deserve it, we're open to it, and we show up. That is grace, and it is amazing. Believing the propaganda that the committee tells us only hurts us. Venturing far enough into vulnerability will reveal not that we are lovable without being perfect, but we are lovable because we're not perfect. Such an epiphany is empowering, and it will prompt us to do what we have always wanted to do since they arrived. And that is to march upstairs to where that committee of voices stands, break down the door, and fire every one of them. We need to stand up to those voices so that we can say, you know what, Ronald, you're a bum. What makes Elizabeth so amazing and lovable has nothing to do with her clothes. It's because of her courage to fight dragons and decide what really belongs in her heart. As we embark on the hard work of exploring anti-racism, what it means to let go of bias, which is really just fear personalized against other people, and to confront generations of embedded inequality for people of color, we're going to have to let go of being perfect, because I will tell you right now, no one ever got woke by being perfect. The bottom line, it's all about love. Making room for it, showing up for it, even though some of us, most of us, all of us probably have a zit the size of Rhode Island affixed somewhere on our life. Someday, I promise you, if you reach a heightened state of courage and spiritual discipline, you too may get a chance to stand in a pulpit and preach a sermon with one right on your nose. Until that day, let me make you this promise. If you show up, tender but open, if you are willing to listen others into their truth, and you are courageous enough to speak your own, this faith will love you. If you choose love over ego, patience and humility over agenda, this congregation and these people will love you. If you risk bringing your most imperfect and love-filled heart into the hard conversations that line the road to the beloved community, I will love you. And you know what? I'll go one better. I will say that even if you don't do any of these things, we're all going to love you anyway. And you don't have to prove anything or justify anything to anyone, anytime, ever. To know that is to know the grace that saves souls and wretches like me. Amazing Grace. It's a song I have loved and will always love. But to tell you the truth, since I've been accepting my more imperfect or even wretched parts, I've been trying to move on to a new song. How could anyone ever tell you you are anything less than beautiful? Because after I started to learn how to stop self-sabotaging myself, I began understanding what an amazing bit of joyful grace is contained in loving others, to help those who are lost feel found, to help those who are blind begin to see, to the glory of life.